Before she became a ghost ship, the RMS Queen Mary was a legend of the seas. Launched in 1936 from the shipyards of Clydebank, Scotland, she was the pride of the Cunard line, a floating palace of steel, speed, and style. With 3 towering smokestacks and a hull stretching over 1,000 feet, she was not just a vessel, she was a statement. The Queen Mary could cross the Atlantic in less than 4 days, faster than most could imagine. Her interiors rivaled the world's finest hotels, sweeping ballrooms with gleaming parquet floors, wood-paneled lounges with soft leather chairs, and dining rooms where crystal chandeliers reflected candlelight across polished silverware. Even her swimming pools were masterpieces of Art Deco elegance, tiled in geometric patterns, framed by chrome and marble. But the Queen Mary was not only about luxury. Beneath her refined decks beat the heart of a technological marvel. Her engines generated over 160,000 horsepower, driving massive bronze propellers that churned through the ocean at a steady, relentless pace. She was the playground of the wealthy elite. Celebrities, royalty, and politicians strolled her promenade decks, sipping champagne as the ocean stretched endlessly around them. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor, Clark Gable, Winston Churchill. For those who could afford the ticket, crossing on the Queen Mary was not simply travel, it was theater. Yet even in those early years, a certain weight seemed to hang in her corridors. Crew members whispered about strange knocks behind steel walls, unexplained drafts in sealed compartments, and the way some passengers would insist they felt watched while walking alone at night. It was easy to dismiss. Every ship had its noises, its quirks, and the Queen Mary was new, untested, a young monarch on the seas. The thought that she could one day become synonymous with hauntings and restless spirits would have seemed absurd. Still, history has a way of leaving its fingerprints long before the events themselves take shape. The Queen Mary's maiden voyages were triumphant. She captured the blue ribbon for the fastest Atlantic crossing. Newspapers hailed her as the last great ocean liner and the Queen of the Seas. But behind the headlines, the world was hurtling toward chaos. Political tensions were rising in Europe, and within just a few years, her red and black funnels would be repainted battleship gray. Her decks, once filled with laughter and music, would echo with the sound of boots, orders, and the heavy machinery of war. For now, though, in those final years before the storm, the Queen Mary reigned supreme. From Southampton to New York, she sliced through the ocean like a blade, her bow throwing white water aside in graceful arcs. At night, her lights glowed like a floating city in the dark, a beacon of progress, elegance, and human ambition. Passengers leaned on the railings, breathing in the cold salt air, never imagining that decades later, those same decks would be walked by ghost tour guides and paranormal investigators. That the grand lounges would become places where visitors claimed to hear phantom footsteps, laughter with no source, and voices from another time. The Queen Mary's story had begun in an age of optimism, but the seas she would sail were about to turn dark. And once the darkness touched her steel, it would never fully let go. She was built to be a queen. She would become something far stranger. In the late 1930s, the Queen Mary was still the undisputed monarch of the seas. She had shattered transatlantic speed records, hosted the world's elite, and embodied a level of luxury unmatched by any ship before her. But as her propellers churned the Atlantic into white froth, storm clouds, not of weather, but of history, were gathering over Europe. By September of 1939, the illusion of peace was gone. The outbreak of the Second World War changed everything. Ocean liners like the Queen Mary, once floating palaces, were suddenly considered strategic assets, too large, too fast, and too valuable to be left idle. The orders came quickly. Her lavish carpets were rolled up and stored away. The ballroom, once filled with champagne and music, became a mess hall. Crystal and silverware were replaced with steel trays. The Queen Mary's gleaming white hull and red funnels were painted an ominous shade of naval gray, erasing her peacetime identity. From that moment on, she would be known as the Gray Ghost. Stripped of her opulence, the Queen Mary was transformed into a troopship. Her purpose now was not leisure, but survival. Her spacious cabins, once reserved for the wealthy few, were filled with bunk beds stacked 3 high. Where there had been fine china and formal dining, There were now field rations and hastily served meals. And yet, she remained one of the fastest ships afloat, a fact that made her invaluable to the Allied war effort. Her speed allowed her to outrun enemy submarines, and her size meant she could carry as many as 15,000 troops in a single voyage, a staggering number, the equivalent of a small army. The Grey Ghost would cross the oceans in blackout conditions, every porthole sealed, every light extinguished at night to avoid detection. In the pitch-black corridors, soldiers slept, wrote letters home, and tried not to think about the war that awaited them on the other side. The ship's wartime service was not without danger. She was a high-value target, and every voyage carried the risk of attack. Enemy submarines lurked beneath the waves, and the Queen Mary's crew maintained constant vigilance. Armed escorts accompanied her when possible, but often she relied solely on her speed and the unpredictability of her zigzagging course to evade torpedoes. One of the darkest moments in her military career came in October 1942, off the coast of Ireland. The Queen Mary, carrying over 10,000 American troops, accidentally collided with her escort cruiser, HMS Curacao. The smaller ship was split in two, sinking within minutes. Over 300 sailors were lost. The Queen Mary, under strict orders not to stop for survivors in case of enemy attack, steamed ahead, a decision that haunted her crew for the rest of their lives. Those who served aboard her during the war spoke of a different kind of haunting, not of ghosts, but of memories. The echo of boots on metal decks. The smell of oil and salt water mixed with the tension of thousands of men bound for battle. The ocean was unforgiving, and so was the mission. Yet, in her grim new role, the Queen Mary was a lifeline. She ferried troops across treacherous seas, carried wounded soldiers home, and even transported Winston Churchill himself on several occasions. Churchill would later claim that the Queen Mary and her sister ship, the Queen Elizabeth, shortened the war by at least a year. By 1945, the war was over, but the Queen Mary's transformation had left its mark. She returned to civilian service, her luxurious interiors restored, her hull repainted in the cheerful red, white, and black. To passengers boarding her once again for pleasure cruises, she appeared unchanged, as if the war had been just a bad dream. But those who had served aboard her knew differently. They remembered the silent voyages through dangerous waters, the cramped quarters, the constant fear. They remembered the HMS Curacao and the faces of soldiers who never returned. Some say it was during those war years that the first true ghosts of the Queen Mary were born, not from legend, but from tragedy. Death at sea has a way of lingering, and the steel walls of the Grey Ghost had witnessed more than their share. The Queen Mary had survived the war, but she was no longer just a ship. She was a survivor, a witness, and perhaps something more, a vessel that carried not just passengers, but the weight of everything she had seen. The luxury liner that had once symbolized human triumph now carried the ghosts of a darker chapter in history. And some of those ghosts, it seemed, had no intention of leaving. By the mid-1960s, the golden age of ocean liners was ending. Jet air travel had taken over, making the once glamorous transatlantic crossing an outdated luxury. Even the mighty Queen Mary, with her record-breaking voyages and wartime heroics, could no longer compete. In 1967, after more than 3 decades at sea, she made her final voyage, not to another port of call, but to her permanent home. Long Beach, California, had purchased the Queen Mary with grand ambitions. She would be transformed into a floating hotel, museum, and tourist attraction, a monument to a bygone era. When she arrived, thousands gathered to watch as tugs guided the massive ship into her final berth. The once restless queen of the oceans was now tethered for good. At first, she seemed simply a relic, a beautiful reminder of a different time. Visitors marveled at her Art Deco interiors, wandered through her engine rooms, and dined in her grand salons. But as the years passed, the Queen Mary began to reveal a different side of herself. Maintenance crews working late reported strange occurrences, tools vanishing and reappearing in impossible places, sudden cold spots in rooms with no open windows, and the faint sound of footsteps in empty corridors. Some workers laughed it off. Others refused to be alone on certain decks after dark. The ship, it seemed, did not sleep. Guests began to have their own stories. Couples staying overnight would wake to find their cabin doors open, even though they had been locked. Others reported the sound of running water in their bathrooms, only to find the taps dry. Some heard music, faint strains of a big band orchestra, drifting through the halls long after the last tour had ended. Perhaps most unsettling were the voices. Tourists and staff alike spoke of hearing conversations just around the corner, footsteps approaching from behind. But when they turned, there was no one there. These experiences didn't seem tied to one location. They happened everywhere, from the sunlit promenade deck to the darkened depths of the boiler rooms. It was around this time that paranormal investigators began to take interest. The Queen Mary wasn't just a historical artifact. She was becoming one of the most haunted places in America. Local newspapers ran stories about ghost sightings, and soon, the ship was drawing not just tourists, but thrill-seekers eager for a brush with the supernatural. Management leaned into the growing reputation. Ghost tours were introduced, guiding visitors into the ship's most notorious spots: the first-class swimming pool, engine room 13, and cabin B340. Whether or not you believed in ghosts, the Queen Mary knew how to make you feel uneasy. Some say the ship's transformation into a stationary attraction intensified her hauntings. Without the constant churn of the ocean, the Queen Mary became still, her long corridors holding echoes like a drum. Spaces that had once bustled with life now sat in silence. The perfect stage for old memories to replay themselves. And perhaps the ship herself remembered the laughter of ballroom dances, the grim urgency of wartime crossings, and the tragedies that had taken place within her steel walls. Those who believe in such things would say she was more than metal and rivets. She was alive in some way, and she was keeping her stories close. By the end of her first decade in Long Beach, the Queen Mary had settled into her role as both a tourist attraction and a ghost story. She was no longer racing across the Atlantic or dodging U-boats, but she was still making headlines, this time for reasons far stranger. Visitors arrived expecting history and left with something they couldn't explain: a sound, a glimpse, a chill. And whether you came to admire her beauty or confront her ghosts, one thing became clear: the Queen Mary was far from finished telling her story. If you spend enough time aboard the Queen Mary, you'll notice it. The feeling that the ship is not empty, even when you know you're alone. The hallways seem to hold their breath when you step inside, and sometimes they exhale. Guests have reported sudden gusts of cold air rushing past them in sealed corridors where there are no windows and no open doors. These winds carry no scent of the sea, just an odd, metallic chill, like the breath of the ship itself. Some say it's a trick of the ventilation system. Others aren't so sure. The crew calls these living hallways. In some places, the temperature can drop more than 20 degrees without warning, as if an unseen presence has brushed past you. And then there are the sounds. Not the distant creak of metal or the groan of an old vessel settling in the harbor, but footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing steps that seem to follow you, keeping pace, even when you stop. One former night security officer told of his rounds along D deck, a section of the ship mostly off-limits to guests. He swore he heard someone walking behind him, heavy boots striking the deck. When he turned, there was no one. He resumed walking. The steps started again. He stopped. So did they. This wasn't an isolated story. Tour guides have spoken of leading groups through these same corridors and hearing doors slam in empty cabins. Others have seen shapes, dark, human silhouettes, slip into doorways only to vanish when approached. What's most unsettling is that these hallways don't seem to follow the same rules as the rest of the ship. People have reported walking down them, turning a corner, and finding themselves back where they started, as if the ship's interior is subtly rearranging itself. Rational minds call it disorientation, but the regulars have another word for it: the ship playing with you. Sometimes, the ship's games go further. A couple staying overnight once reported becoming trapped in a hallway. Every door they tried was locked. The hallway seemed longer than before, stretching endlessly in both directions. Then, just as suddenly as it began, they rounded a corner and found themselves back by the elevator. Was it just confusion in a maze of identical corridors? Possibly. But the Queen Mary has a way of making even the most grounded visitors question what's real. And then there's the breathing. It's subtle, so subtle that some dismiss it outright. But late at night, in the quietest parts of the ship, people claim they can hear a deep, slow inhale, followed by an equally slow exhale. The sound doesn't come from any vent or pipe. It comes from everywhere at once, as if the ship itself is alive. Paranormal researchers have recorded these sounds, noting that they don't match any mechanical system aboard. To believers, it's proof that the Queen Mary is more than haunted, she's sentient. To skeptics, it's just another story. But both agree, once you've walked her hallways at night, you never quite forget the feeling. Even daylight doesn't completely banish the strangeness. Morning tours have been interrupted by sudden bangs, the faint smell of cigarette smoke in non-smoking areas, and the soft murmur of voices speaking in languages no one recognizes. Whatever haunts the Queen Mary doesn't seem bound by time. Perhaps that's why these hallways feel like they're waiting, not just for footsteps, but for memories to replay themselves. In the stillness, you can almost imagine the ship's past superimposed over the present. Sailors in crisp uniforms, passengers in evening gowns, laughter drifting through the air. And then it's gone, leaving only the echo of your own breathing. The hallways of the Queen Mary are more than passageways. They're arteries in a body that never truly died. They carry not just the ghosts of the ship's past, but the living, breathing essence of the vessel herself. And for those who dare to walk them in the dead of night, there's always the lingering question, are you passing through the ship, or is the ship passing through you? The first-class swimming pool aboard the Queen Mary was once a showpiece of elegance, a shimmering turquoise jewel in the heart of the ship. In her prime, the water reflected golden light from ornate lamps, and the sound of splashing mingled with polite laughter. Passengers would descend the curved staircase, wrapped in thick towels, ready for an afternoon swim. Today, the pool sits dry, the water long since drained for safety reasons. The tiled floor is cold and silent, the diving board's gone. But silence is not the same as emptiness. Many who step inside claim the pool is still occupied. The most famous spirit said to linger here is a young girl, often referred to as Jackie. No one knows exactly how she died. The official records offer no clear story. Some say she drowned during a crossing in the 1940s. Others insist she never died aboard the Queen Mary at all, and her spirit simply found this place. Visitors report hearing her giggle echoing across the empty pool. Guides have described the sound of small, wet footprints following them along the tile, prints that vanish after a few steps. Sometimes, the splashing of water can be heard, faint at first, then louder, though the pool remains bone dry. Paranormal investigators have spent long nights in this room, and many leave convinced something, or someone, is here. High-quality audio equipment has captured what sounds like a child's voice, calling out "Mommy" or softly singing. In one recording, a faint splash echoes just after the sound of a girl's laughter. Skeptics argue that the acoustics of the tiled room play tricks on the ears, bouncing distant noises from elsewhere in the ship. But others point out that the sounds are too specific, too perfectly timed to be coincidence. And Jackie isn't the only one. Several visitors have reported the presence of a tall man in an old-fashioned swimsuit, standing silently by the diving board. He never speaks, never moves, and vanishes the moment you glance away. Some guides believe he may have been a passenger from the ship's earliest days, when swimwear was modest and formal. Others feel a more oppressive energy, a sense of being watched from the upper balconies. The shadows there seem deeper than they should be, and more than one person has hurried their tour when an unshakable feeling crept over them. Even seasoned staff members tread carefully here after dark. One longtime guide recounted locking the pool area for the night, only to hear water dripping moments later. When he returned, the room was as dry as before, except for a small puddle near the deep end, perfectly round, with no source above. Visitors on ghost tours often try to speak to Jackie, calling her name or leaving small toys at the pool's edge. Some swear they've heard a child's laughter in direct response. Others leave unsettled, convinced that something brushed against their hand or tugged at their sleeve. The Phantom Pool has become one of the Queen Mary's most famous haunted locations, drawing both believers and skeptics. For some, it's a place of playful mischief, the spirit of a lonely child seeking attention. For others, it's a reminder that the ship carries memories too heavy to fade. Whether you hear splashing water, see vanishing footprints, or simply feel a shiver crawl up your spine, one truth is hard to deny. The Queen Mary's pool may be empty, but it is far from lifeless. Deep within the steel belly of the Queen Mary lies Engine Room 13, a place as legendary for its tragedy as it is for its engineering. Even during the day, this space feels alien compared to the ship's elegant upper decks. The polished woods and golden lights above are replaced here with oil-slick metal, low ceilings, and a labyrinth of pipes and pistons. The air is always thick, carrying the ghost of hot machinery long since stilled. When the Queen Mary was in service, this was her heart, a roaring, unrelenting world of heat and noise. Engineers worked in deafening conditions, with the thunder of pistons and the hiss of steam drowning out even the loudest shouts. The temperature could rise past 110 degrees, and the men on shift often left their posts drenched in sweat. It was dangerous work, but it was the lifeblood of the ship. Every crossing, every voyage, depended on the steady rhythm of this place. But for all its power, the engine room was also unforgiving. And on a day in 1966, that unforgiving nature claimed a life. It happened during a routine safety drill, the kind every crew member knew by heart. The watertight doors, built to seal off compartments in case of flooding, were designed to close with crushing force. Once the alarm sounded, crewmen had just seconds to pass through before the heavy steel slammed shut. John Petter, a young crewman in his 20s, was in Shaft Alley near door 13 when the drill began. The details of what followed vary depending on who tells the story. Some say he tried to slip through the narrowing gap, misjudging the timing. Others claim he had been repairing something and was caught unaware. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. The massive door closed on him with unimaginable force. By the time help arrived, Petter was gone. His death was not the first aboard the Queen Mary, but it was one of the most shocking in her final years of service. The crew was shaken. Many avoided speaking about it, but word spread quickly among the sailors and engineers. Door 13 had taken a life, and from that day on, it carried a weight beyond its steel. It didn't take long before strange reports began to surface. Engineers working the lower decks claimed to see a man in dark coveralls standing near door 13, only to have him vanish when they approached. Some described hearing heavy boot steps echoing along the catwalk, pacing steadily, matching their own. When they stopped, so did the steps. Paranormal investigators visiting years later would hear similar stories from tour guides and maintenance staff. One guide recalled leading a group past the door when a sudden metallic clang echoed through the passage, as if someone had struck the steel with a wrench. The sound was so loud that several visitors flinched, but when they searched, no one was there. Perhaps the most unnerving accounts come from those who claim to have felt a physical presence. More than one guest has reported a sudden push on their back or shoulder while standing in the narrow passage. Not enough to knock them over, but enough to make them step back instinctively. One woman swore that as she leaned forward to take a picture of the door, something icy brushed against her arm. EVP sessions, attempts to record ghostly voices, have captured chilling results in this part of the ship. Words like "watch it" and "leave" have been heard in deep, male voices. In one case, a recording picked up what sounded like labored breathing followed by the distinct slam of a watertight door, even though the mechanism has been inactive for decades. Infrared cameras have shown unexplained heat signatures appearing briefly near door 13 before fading to nothing. In other instances, cold spots, sudden drops in temperature of more than 20 degrees, have been recorded in the exact place where Petter died. Skeptics argue that the odd sensations could be the result of drafts, echoing noises from other parts of the ship, or even the psychological effect of knowing you're standing in a place tied to a violent death. But even the most rational visitors admit the atmosphere here is different, oppressive, almost watchful. Some say Petter isn't angry. They describe the sensation of someone standing quietly nearby, as if observing rather than threatening. A few claim to hear faint humming, like a man singing to himself while working. Others have reported glimpsing a face reflected in the gleaming surface of a brass gauge, only for it to disappear when they turn. Yet there are also accounts that speak of urgency, even warning. One visitor recounted that during a tour, she lingered behind to take photos. As she adjusted her camera, she distinctly heard a voice in her ear whisper, "Hurry." Startled, she looked around, but the rest of the group had already moved on, and she was alone. Today, Engine Room 13 is one of the highlights of the Queen Mary's ghost tours. Guides lead the curious down the same narrow walkways where crew once worked in blistering heat, pausing at the steel door that has been locked in place for decades. Visitors are encouraged to stand in the passage and listen. Some hear nothing. Others claim to catch faint footsteps, the clang of metal, or even the low murmur of a man's voice. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, there's an undeniable gravity to this place. The air feels heavier. The shadows seem deeper. And the story of John Petter, whether his spirit truly lingers here or not, has become inseparable from the Queen Mary's identity. The ship's engines may be silent, but in the depths of engine room 13, the echoes of her past still move. And for some, the sensation is clear: Petter never left. He's still here, pacing the catwalks, keeping watch, and reminding anyone who dares to linger that this is his territory now. The Queen Mary carries more than memories in her steel hull. Some say she carries guests who never left. Across her decks, certain staterooms have earned reputations as places where the night is far longer than it should be, where time bends, and where the ordinary rules of the living world no longer apply. These are the never-check-out cabins, rooms that tempt the curious, terrify the unprepared, and refuse to let go of their secrets. Foremost among them is the infamous stateroom B340. Today, it's known by ghost hunters worldwide, but its story began quietly, without warning, in the ship's earliest years of service. Originally, B340 was an ordinary passenger cabin, modest in size but comfortable, with warm wood-paneled walls and a porthole view of the open sea. But the first complaints were unlike anything the crew had heard before. Guests awoke to blankets ripped from the bed, to drawers sliding open one by one in the dead of night, and to the sound of whispers threading through the dark. At first, stewards dismissed the reports as seasickness or imagination. But when multiple passengers, strangers to each other, described the same events, it became harder to explain away. Some claimed to hear a deep, rasping breath just inches from their ear while lying in bed, though no one else was in the room. Others insisted they saw shadowy shapes moving in the corners, darker than the darkness around them. The turning point came in the mid-1960s, when a passenger in B340 reportedly suffered a mental break during an Atlantic crossing. According to whispers among the crew, he pounded on the walls, screaming that voices were taunting him. His behavior grew violent, and he had to be removed and kept under watch for the rest of the voyage. The official records never confirmed his story, but after that incident, the number of complaints about the room spiked sharply. In time, the disturbances became so notorious that management locked B340 entirely, refusing to rent it out. For decades, the cabin sat empty, its door firmly shut, fueling speculation about what had happened inside. Crew members avoided it, and when asked, they would only say, "Some rooms are better left alone." But isolation didn't quiet the legends. Those passing in the hallway outside claimed to hear faint knocks from within, or the creak of floorboards as if someone were pacing. One former security guard swore he heard water running in the bathroom late one night, though the door was locked and the cabin officially unused. When the Queen Mary eventually reopened B340 as part of a paranormal attraction, they leaned into its reputation. The room was outfitted with an antique Ouija board, tarot cards, and even a ghost hunting kit for brave overnight guests. The first reports from those stays only deepened the mystery. Bed sheets yanked away, faucets opening by themselves, and lights flickering violently until bulbs shattered. B340 may be the most famous, but it's not alone. Stateroom B474 is said to have an unseen visitor who knocks on the door every night at exactly 3 a.m. 3 sharp raps, perfectly spaced, always at the same time. No one is ever there. Then there's M051, a cabin tied to one of the ship's most frequently seen apparitions, a woman in a glittering 1930s evening gown. Guests report seeing her in the mirror, adjusting a pearl necklace, smiling faintly, only to turn and find the room empty. Other cabins have quieter hauntings, but no less unnerving. Some guests describe waking to the feeling of the mattress dipping beside them, as if someone invisible had sat down. In one case, a man awoke to find the impression of a handprint pressed into the pillow next to his head, cool to the touch, as though whoever had left it had been there only moments earlier. Theories about these hauntings vary. Some point to the Queen Mary's long history, filled with wartime service, accidents, and countless private dramas behind closed doors. Others believe the ship itself, a towering steel giant, has absorbed the emotions of decades, replaying them in loops for those sensitive enough to notice. Skeptics argue that old ships creak, wiring fails, and drafts cause strange sensations. Yet even they can't fully explain the consistency of the reports. The same voices, the same shapes, the same knocks, and the fact that they happen in the same rooms, year after year, to people who've never heard the stories before. One woman who lasted just 2 hours in B340 said she woke to find the bed shaking violently, though nothing else in the room moved. Another guest reported that while brushing his teeth in B474, he watched the bathroom doors slowly swing shut, lock itself, and then unlock without a sound. Perhaps the most unsettling truth is that there's no way to predict what, or who, you might encounter in these rooms. Some guests leave with nothing more than a story of an odd creak or flickering light. Others leave in the middle of the night, pale and trembling, refusing to return. The Queen Mary's never check out. Cabins remain an open invitation to the daring and the curious. But stepping through those doors means stepping into a space where history, rumor, and the supernatural blur into one. And if you're very unlucky, you might find yourself wishing that checkout time would come much, much sooner. Legends and rumors can take root anywhere, but aboard the Queen Mary, the stories have something stronger behind them: testimony. These are not just whispered tales told after dark to thrill tourists. They are accounts from the ship's crew, security officers, tour guides, and guests, recorded in interviews, caught on tape, and remembered vividly for years. When the ship was still in service, strange experiences were occasionally mentioned, but after she retired and became a floating hotel in Long Beach, the volume of reports grew. Maintenance workers fixing plumbing would hear voices on decks closed to the public. Housekeepers claimed to smell cigar smoke in cabins where smoking had been banned for decades. And security officers, many with military or law enforcement backgrounds, began telling stories they once would have laughed at. One of the most often repeated accounts came from retired Chief Engineer Bill Hansen. Late one night, while inspecting the lower decks, he saw a man in blue overalls step into a side passage. I called out, thinking it was one of my guys, he recalled years later. But when I turned the corner, there was nothing. No sound of boots, no open doors, just empty steel and my own footsteps. Security Officer Maria Lopez told a similar story about her patrol near the bow. It was around 2 in the morning. I could hear footsteps ahead of me, heavy ones, like someone wearing work boots. They stayed just out of sight, turning corners before I could catch up. Then they stopped completely. The silence after was worse than the sound. These aren't isolated incidents. Over the decades, dozens of employees have reported seeing shadowy figures in work clothes from the 1930s and 40s, walking with purpose before vanishing into walls. Then there's the first-class swimming pool, long drained and closed to the public. Tour guide David Marsh remembered locking up for the night when he heard what sounded like gentle splashing, followed by the echo of a woman's laugh. The pool's been dry for decades, he said. There was no water to splash in. Guests on nighttime tours have reported seeing wet footprints appear across the empty tiled floor, leading toward the dressing rooms before fading away. Sometimes, the smell of chlorine fills the air, sharp and fresh, even though the pool hasn't been in use since the 1960s. Many believe these moments belong to a spirit known as Jackie. Over the years, paranormal investigators have captured high-pitched laughter, the sound of a ball bouncing, and faint splashes. In one recording, a child's voice responds directly to a question with the words, "Come play." Skeptics argue it's audio contamination, but those who've stood in that space alone say the energy is unmistakable, a strange mix of playfulness and deep sorrow. Some guides claim Jackie will even answer if you call her name, though only in a whisper you can barely hear. Cabin encounters are just as intense. Margaret Stevens, a guest who stayed in stateroom B340, described waking in the middle of the night to find her bed shaking violently. I grabbed my phone. It was 3:04 a.m. The shaking stopped, but the bathroom light was on. I turned it off before bed. Another visitor, staying in B474, claimed to see a man in a dark 1940s suit standing by the porthole, looking out at the ocean. He didn't turn around when I spoke to him, she said. He just faded. like smoke blowing away. Housekeeping staff have their own stories, doors unlocking themselves, televisions switching on with static, and neatly made beds found in disarray minutes later. What makes these accounts powerful is their consistency. Different witnesses, many with no knowledge of the ship's ghost stories, describe the same details: the same man in the same suit by the same porthole, the same laughter in the empty pool, the same footsteps pacing the same corridors at the same hour of the night. Perhaps the Queen Mary isn't simply haunted by individuals. Perhaps she holds echoes, moments from her long history imprinted in her steel, replaying themselves for those attuned enough to notice. To the skeptics, these are coincidences, the product of suggestion and imagination. But to those who've heard the footsteps, seen the faces, and felt the air grow cold in an otherwise warm room, the Queen Mary is a place where the past doesn't stay buried. It walks, it speaks, and it waits for the next person to listen. When war came to the Atlantic, the Queen Mary shed her royal colors. Gone were the white hull and red and black smokestacks. In their place, a coat of battleship gray, applied in secrecy, transforming her into something new, the Gray Ghost. In peacetime, she had carried Hollywood stars, royalty, and millionaires. Now she would carry soldiers, thousands of them, across waters hunted by U-boats. Her mission was dangerous, her cargo precious, and her speed her greatest weapon. At over 30 knots, she could outrun almost anything that floated. But speed alone couldn't erase the risk. Every voyage was a gamble, and the Queen Mary played her part in the most dangerous theater of war. Her transformation was complete in 1940. Luxury staterooms became barracks. Lounges turned into mess halls. The grand ballroom was stripped bare to make room for rows of bunks stacked 3 high. At full capacity, she could carry over 15,000 men, more than any other ship of her kind. Soldiers remember the endless corridors smelling of oil and salt, the constant vibration of the engines, and the way the ocean seemed to press against every wall. For some, the Queen Mary was a lifeline to the fight ahead. For others, she was the last home they would ever know. Paranormal investigators today believe that some of those men never left. Guests have reported hearing the sound of boots marching in unison along the decks in the dead of night, the metallic echo ringing through otherwise silent halls. The most haunting chapter of the Queen Mary's wartime service came on October 2, 1942. Escorting her through treacherous waters was HMS Curacao, a British light cruiser. In heavy seas, during a zigzag maneuver to avoid enemy submarines, tragedy struck. The Queen Mary sliced through the Curaçao's hull at full speed, splitting her in two. Over 300 men were thrown into the freezing Atlantic. The Queen Mary, under strict wartime orders not to stop for survivors, steamed on. Rescue ships arrived later, but for most, it was too late. It is said that some of those sailors remain aboard, not in body, but in presence. Visitors near the bow have claimed to see the fleeting image of a man in a Royal Navy uniform, soaked to the skin, vanishing when approached. Others hear splashing, followed by shouts for help that fade into the wind. During the rest of the war, the Queen Mary's speed kept her safe, but the tension was constant. Every shadow on the horizon might be a periscope. Every thud in the hull might be the echo of a torpedo. Men slept in shifts, clutching letters from home. Some soldiers later told of hearing voices in the night, not from their bunkmates, but from somewhere deeper in the ship. One man recalled waking to the sound of a harmonica playing softly, though instruments were forbidden in the sleeping quarters. Another swore he saw a figure in a greatcoat walking through a locked bulkhead as if it were smoke. In the engine room, where the Queen Mary's power was born, crew members worked in a world of deafening noise and stifling heat. Some claimed they could feel a presence there, as though someone was always just behind them, unseen but close enough to sense. One former engineer described hearing his name called while alone at his post. "It was clear as day, just behind my shoulder," he said. "I turned, but there was nothing, just the machinery, and the air felt suddenly cold." To this day, visitors touring the engine room sometimes report the same thing: a cold hand brushing past, the faint scent of oil mixed with salt water, and the unmistakable sound of footsteps on steel. By the war's end, the Queen Mary had carried over 800,000 troops and traveled more than 600,000 miles. She had earned her nickname, the Gray Ghost, not just for her color, but for her uncanny ability to appear and vanish across the Atlantic without being caught. Yet for all her victories, the cost was high. The lives lost at sea, the fear etched into the faces of those who served aboard her. These things don't simply fade. On quiet nights, when the ocean is calm and the ship rests in her berth at Long Beach, some say you can still feel the weight of those years pressing against the hull. The war ended, but for parts of the Queen Mary, it never truly stopped. The gray ghost still sails, not through the waves, but through the memories and shadows of all who walked her decks when the world was at war. The RMS Queen Mary rests today as a museum, a hotel, and a monument to another age, but anyone who has spent a night aboard knows she is far more than a relic. Her massive hull holds a century's worth of stories, and some of them seem unwilling to stay in the past. She is a survivor of the golden age of ocean travel, a veteran of wartime service, and, if the accounts are to be believed, a host to countless unseen guests who walk her decks when the living are asleep. From her earliest days, the Queen Mary seemed to collect experiences the way other ships collected barnacles. Laughter from gala evenings in the first-class ballroom, the tense silence of wartime crossings, the muffled sobs of farewells on crowded troop decks, all layered into her very structure. And as the decades passed, these echoes began to stir. By day, she is immaculate, polished brass, rich wood paneling, a glamour carefully preserved for visitors. But when night falls, the ship changes. The hum of tourists fades, and a deeper silence takes over, broken only by the slow creak of her hull against the tide and the distant groan of strained metal. The air grows cooler, as though the warmth drains away with the daylight. It is in this stillness that the strange moments happen. Security officers making rounds have seen shadows move against the grain of the light, crossing hallways where no one stands. Doors that were locked in the evening are found ajar by morning. More than once, closed-off rooms have been discovered with furniture inexplicably shifted, as though someone had been there and left without leaving a trace. One of the most unsettling pieces of evidence came from the ship's ballroom. A motion-triggered camera, left running overnight, captured a lone chair sliding across the floor several feet, with no one near it. The movement was slow, deliberate, almost as if pushed by an unseen hand. There was no draft, no vibration, nothing to account for it. Some on the night shift have spoken about entire corridors lighting up on their monitors, as if every motion sensor had been triggered at once, yet when checked in person, the spaces are empty. Others tell of hearing faint music, a waltz or jazz tune from the 1930s, drifting from the grand salon when it is locked and dark. Guests, too, leave with their own accounts. A woman in a vintage gown strolling along the promenade, vanishing as she passes behind a lifeboat. The echo of footsteps pacing above a stateroom in the middle of the night, only to discover there is no deck above it. The unmistakable sound of laughter in the first-class pool area, long since drained of water and locked to the public. Some visitors check in as skeptics and check out unwilling to sleep alone for several nights afterward. Even the most rational minds admit that the Queen Mary has a way of unsettling you, of making you question what your senses are telling you. Paranormal investigators from around the world have called her one of the most active haunted locations ever documented. They bring sophisticated equipment, EMF meters, thermal cameras, high-sensitivity audio recorders, and often leave with something they cannot explain. Whispers caught in empty rooms, sudden drops in temperature, dark shapes darting across hallways on infrared. Skeptics suggest drafts, faulty wiring, or the power of suggestion, yet many investigators return again and again, convinced that the Queen Mary is not just a building on water, but a living archive of human experience, one that sometimes speaks. Decades after her last voyage, the Queen Mary refuses to fade quietly into history. Her decks remember every step, her walls hold every voice, and some of those voices still answer back. Whether they are echoes, residual energy, or something conscious, no one can say for certain. If you walk her corridors after midnight, you might find nothing at all, or you might feel the temperature drop, hear a faint knock from the steel hull, or glimpse a figure just at the edge of your vision. She may be moored to the dock now, but in some ways, the Queen Mary never stopped sailing. She still moves, through memory, through shadow, and through the lives of those who dare to come aboard.